There is a child alive today who would have died. In 1960, childhood leukemia had a survival rate of less than 10%. Today it is over 90%. The drug that changed that survival rate, vincristine, came from a flower, a small pink flower called the rosy periwinkle from Madagascar. And the people of Madagascar had been using that flower for centuries, for diabetes, for wasp stings, for bleeding. They didn't know about leukemia. They didn't need to. They knew the plant worked, and nobody asked them before patenting it. This is not an isolated story. It is the story of modern medicine. In 1985, the World Health Organization estimated that roughly 80% of the world's population relied primarily on traditional plant-based medicine. A 2001 study analyzed 122 plant-derived compounds used in Western pharmaceuticals. Of those 122 compounds, 80% were being used by indigenous peoples for the same medical purposes before Western science ever looked at them. 80%, not a coincidence, a pattern. And the pattern has a name that pharmaceutical companies would prefer you didn't know. It's called bioprospecting, or, depending on who you ask, biopiracy. Here is how it works. An ethnobotanist goes into the field. They talk to healers. They learn what plants are used for pain, infection, fever, inflammation. They collect samples. They bring them back to a laboratory. And if the compound shows promise, a company files a patent. The patent belongs to the company. The knowledge that led them there, accumulated over hundreds or thousands of years, belongs to no one. The healers receive nothing. The communities receive nothing. In 1994, the United States Patent Office granted a patent on the use of turmeric to heal wounds. Turmeric, a spice that Indian households had been using for exactly that purpose for at least 3,000 years. The Indian government spent 2 years and significant resources challenging the patent. They won, but only because they had the resources to fight. Most communities don't. The Neem tree, used in India for over 2,000 years as a pesticide, antiseptic, and contraceptive. In the 1990s, over 90 patents were filed based on Neem's properties, without compensation, without acknowledgement, without permission. Ayahuasca, a ceremonial plant brew used by Amazonian communities for centuries. In 1986, an American citizen filed a patent on the plant itself. The patent was eventually overturned, but for 17 years, a plant central to the spiritual and medical life of dozens of indigenous communities was legally owned by one man. Now step back. This is not a story about individual bad actors. It is a story about a structural blind spot in how Western science understood knowledge. For most of the 20th century, if something wasn't written down, peer-reviewed, and published in a journal, it wasn't considered real knowledge. It was considered folklore, anecdote, primitive belief. But here is what the data actually shows. Plants with documented indigenous medical use showed pharmacological activity more than twice as often as randomly selected plants. Twice as often. They weren't guessing, they were doing empirical science, without the equipment, without the journals, without the funding, and they were right. Aspirin, salicin from willow bark, used by indigenous peoples across North America, Europe, and Asia for pain and fever for thousands of years. The compound was isolated in 1828. The pill was patented in 1899. The knowledge was free. Quinine from the bark of the cinchona tree. The Quechua people of Peru used it to treat shivering from cold. Jesuit missionaries noticed, brought it to Europe. It became the only effective treatment for malaria for 300 years. The Quechua received nothing. Curare, a paralytic poison used by Amazonian hunters on blowgun darts. When Western medicine encountered it, they found it was a precise muscle relaxant that transformed modern surgery. The hunters who refined it over centuries received no credit and no compensation. This is not ancient history. In 2020, a study published in Nature Plants found that of all plant compounds currently in clinical trials, the majority had prior documented use in indigenous medical traditions. The knowledge pipeline is still running, it just runs in one direction. So what changed? In 1993, the Convention on Biological Diversity established that countries have sovereignty over their biological resources. In 2010, the Nagoya Protocol created a framework requiring companies to share benefits with communities whose knowledge they use. Implementation has been slow, enforcement is inconsistent, but the framework exists now, and in some cases it is working. In 2015, a drug company developing a compound from a South African plant used by the San people for appetite suppression signed a benefit-sharing agreement, the first of its kind. They called it a model. They called it progress. Critics called it 40 years late. Here is what nobody disagrees on. The knowledge is real. The plants work, the people who identified them, across thousands of years of observation, experimentation, and accumulated understanding, were doing something that deserves a word more dignified than folklore. They were practicing medicine, without a license, without a patent, without anyone's permission. In many cases, better than the systems that came after them and took credit. A 2019 study estimated that if indigenous medical knowledge were lost entirely, pharmaceutical research would lose its most productive lead source for new drugs. The pipeline would narrow, the discovery rate would drop. They are not a footnote to the history of medicine, they are the foundation of it. And somewhere in Madagascar, there are plants the healers know about that no laboratory has tested yet. And in the Amazon, there are compounds that could change how we treat diseases we currently can't. And in the archives of oral traditions across the world, there is knowledge that took longer to accumulate than Western science has existed. The question is not whether that knowledge has value. The data answered that question decades ago. The question is who it belongs to and who decides.